Hi there. I'd like to talk to you about what it was like in 1993 with the European Community Monitoring Mission out in the field. I arrived in the late spring in Zagreb. It was cold, there was still snow around, and after a week of settling into the mission in terms of administration, we were all detailed off to go to our different areas of responsibility. My area of responsibility was in the vicinity of, but not exactly in, a town called Otterchats. You can see Otterchats on this slide here. I've put an arrow into it from the outside. The town is very close to the front line between the Serb autonomous region of Krajina and the part of Croatia that was still under control of the Croatian government. The mission, the European Community Monitoring Mission, was like no other mission that I had seen up to that point. It was loosely based around the UN military observer missions, and of course I had been a UN military observer in two different missions in Central America. So I was quite surprised when I got to the mission in former Yugoslavia to be called one of the more experienced observers. I had never been to former Yugoslavia before. I spoke none of the language, and I had only the sort of newspaper version of what was happening there in the terrible war. So anyway, what would happen is that four of us would be detailed off to become a team. We would sometimes be reduced to three because of inevitable personnel issues, but we would have an interpreter and preferably four monitors, but at least three, and we would go for 2 weeks to different locations. We would live bed and breakfast in that location, and we would patrol around, gather data, submit daily reports, and do what had to be done. In some cases, there were little field offices actually established. This was the renting of a room or a couple of rooms in a house, a European Commission flag flying outside, and as each team turned over, they took over the use of this little office. Where there were offices, the locals routinely got to use them as places they could report, complain, and 95% of the drop-in traffic in those offices was stuff that couldn't have been solved by a field office because it couldn't be solved by the entire regional organization. But one had to be polite, listen to what people had to say, and do what we had to do. I was greatly struck by, I was a team leader because of my experience, and I was greatly struck by one particular event that occurred that has troubled me quite a lot. Every week, a lady, middle-aged, well-dressed, would come, a local lady, and she would report a terrible, essentially, crime against humanity. Almost 2 years previously, when the main fighting had started and the new front lines had been made, her village was, she was a Croat from a Croat village that had been taken over by Serb forces, and all the male members of her family had been murdered, and it was part of a campaign of ethnic cleansing. These kind of atrocities are committed to get people to run away. They're not committed by, well, some of them are psychopaths, but they're committed by regimes to get people to run away. It was a deliberate attempt to clean the area, as the war in Yugoslavia gave us this dreadful term, ethnic cleansing. So she came every week to report the same problem, and although she was completely functional as a human being outside of the recounting of this story, clearly psychologically she was stuck in that groove, and there was nothing you could do. You couldn't shut the shop because she was coming. You knew she was coming, and you had to deal with it as you could. We took it in turns to deal with this lady, and it is interesting to watch not her, because her story never changed and she never changed. She was frozen in that time when she discovered her family massacred. But it was the monitors that were the interesting situation here. Some of them overcompensated and became very, very sympathetic. Some of them undercompensated and were really quite tough and unfeeling towards her. And I mention this story because it is easy to become very, very involved and to emotionally burn out. And it's easy to just be callous from the beginning and not become involved. What is very difficult is to maintain a sense of engagement, commitment to people as individuals, and not allow the atrocities to really get you down. Something else that happened there that was another interesting observation into the life of a monitor was every day there would be routine reports of ceasefire violations. Ceasefires were made and broken so routinely one almost couldn't keep up with it. I remember one morning, very early before breakfast, phone call that just recently, in the last 90 minutes, there had been a shelling of a position on the Croatian side, and that they wanted the monitors to come immediately to have a look at what was going on. So we jumped in our car with our interpreter, we went down there, met up with the local soldiers who started to tell us all about the shelling and the shooting and the ceasefire violation. And we said, right, okay, we took some notes. And then we said, please, if there has been shelling, show us the actual places where the shells have landed so that we can say that we have witnessed and can confirm that this ceasefire violation has taken place. And the soldiers hummed and hawed a bit and they said, oh, it's too dangerous to take you up there. We would of course be happy to show you, but we can't. And then we would say, well, look, we're all military officers, although we're working in plain clothes with the European Community Monitor Mission. And if you can't show us results, our report will not be given much weight in our headquarters. The more you show us, the more we can confirm. That is why we're here. We're here to confirm the situation on the ground. And so reluctantly, one soldier set off towards the front line, and quite contrary to what he was saying, he was walking very openly. He didn't try to hide himself, camouflage, run from cover to cover. He just walked straight towards the front line. And he then got to a small little ravine that was dry, but had clearly had a small river running in it at some point, quite recently. There were pools in the bottom of the riverbed. The ravine was maybe 4 or 5 meters deep, and crossing it was a set of railroad tracks, but with none of the wooden ties holding the railroad tracks in place. So you had 2 metal beams stretching from bank to bank, and the width of the span was no more than 6 meters, 20 feet or so. The soldier just nonchalantly stepped up on one of the rails and walked straight across and turned round smiling at us. And clearly he was checking to see whether we had the interest, initiative, gumption to be able to follow him. At this point I was pretty cross. So even though I'm terrified of heights, including a small little drop of 3 or 4 meters, I got onto the track and I marched firmly across with my muddy boots and got to the other side, and his face fell. So he took me on another 30, 40 meters into no man's land between the 2 front lines and started pointing to holes in the ground, which were clearly had been formed by small mortar bombs or small shells of some sort exploding. The only problem with the holes was that by now is really quite bright daylight, is that there was grass growing, new grass shoots growing in the bottom of the holes. And so any suggestion that these holes had been made in the few hours prior to my arriving on the scene was simply ridiculous. Even as a Navy guy, I could tell that this was just a story. So we made our way back. We debriefed the senior officer who was in charge of that part of the front line. I believe he was a major, that our report would show that we were sent for, that we were shown shell holes that clearly hadn't been made that night or even that week. And that's what our report would read as. And away we went. So the ability, the desire to manipulate observers is there in all of the combatant parties, and part of the skill of the observer is to neither be overwhelmed nor underwhelmed by what you're being shown. Whether it's a lady in genuine distress or soldiers trying to claim that the ceasefire violation happened last night and simply didn't. They will try to manipulate and they'll try and game you. And that's all I have to say about that. I'd like to go to the Ecmm framework now. So, as you can see from this slide of the Ecmm framework, in the obvious domain for field work, you have the routine patrolling of your area of responsibility. It's both presence patrolling and it's also stopping to talk with people and allowing people to come to you if you have a small office to talk. That's the fundamental bread and butter of your field work. You send in your daily reports. At the same time, you've got to do vehicle and communication maintenance, and you've got to subsist on the local economy. In the former Yugoslavia, it wasn't that bad. In many other missions, in much more difficult economic circumstances, it's frugal and very, very difficult conditions. When you meet with the local civil and military leaders in the complicated domain, you are both representing your mission and also showing them that you are concerned but not going to be taken as a patsy, not going to be sucked in to their particular gaming of the situation. The humanitarian issues are the most difficult because that is often very difficult to, if you don't come from a background where there's great humanitarian privation, you can be quite shocked at the humanitarian issues. And you have to keep your emotions and your own sensibilities under control. You're there to report on the actual humanitarian situation as you see it and you find it physically in front of you in the field. The development of local relationships is really, really important, and it's an adaptive and evolving process, but you will find that time spent investing in serious local leaders will always come back to pay, if not at that time, but on another visit, or maybe for another team on a visit who need a serious interlocutor, and you can say, go to the mayor of such and such a town and tell him that the team that were there that worked with him on the food distribution issue recommend that he speaks to you as a serious interlocutor. You can help really move the process along by doing that. And finally, I would want to put a word in about local criminal activity. The chaotic comes from unexpected quarters, and local criminal activity, which can be misinterpreted as hostility or political activity, has got to be disentangled quickly because it requires a totally different approach, and you've got to become able to see what is political, what is politically motivated, and what is simply criminally motivated. And that's very difficult. So only practice will help you with that. And that's what I have to say about working with the Ecmm.